It was early Christmas Eve morning in 1971 when then 17-year-old Julianne Köpke and her mother got up and began getting ready to make their way to the Jorge Chavez International Airport. There they would be taking the 1-hour flight to go see her father for Christmas. Her father was working deep in the jungle at the Panguana research station that he and her mother had founded. This plays an important part in this story. More on this later. Still excited, having just received her high school diploma at her graduation ceremony the night before, she was not bothered a bit by the crowds of holiday travelers at the airport. See, several flights had been canceled the night before, leaving passengers stranded in the airport overnight, causing the already bustling airport to be unusually crowded and slightly hectic even for a Christmas holiday. The time had finally come. It was just before noon when they began boarding LANSA Flight 508 for what they thought would be a routine flight. How they could not have been more wrong. When boarding was complete, the aircraft, a Lockheed Martin L-188A Electra turboprop, was pushed back. The captain, his crew of 4 and their 86 passengers began to taxi down the runway before the plane lifts off, and they quickly reached altitudes in excess of 21,000 feet, and the flight attendants would begin offering snacks and drinks. Everyone on board, festive with holiday spirit, was chatting and having a great time. 25 minutes into the flight, it happened. A massive explosion rocked the plane, depressurizing the cabin in an instant as the emergency oxygen masks started falling from the ceiling. Bang! A section of the aircraft peeled wide open, literally sucking everything and everyone, including Julianne's mother, out of the plane, as the aircraft breaks apart into pieces, plummeting to Earth over an isolated and remote section of the inhospitable Amazon rainforest. Volunteer and government officials would launch a massive search and rescue effort covering a large area and could not locate the crash site. No debris, nothing, as if it simply vanished. They would search for survivors for 8 straight days before reevaluating the survivability of this tragic event. Authorities had to ask themselves, is it possible to live through whatever had happened on that plane, the plane they could not locate, and then survive what had been the past 9 days now in the wild depths of the jungle? Experts said, no way, not possible. Status of the search was then changed from a rescue mission to a recovery mission, as it was deemed the crash was not survivable. Miraculously, simultaneous to this, the injured but very much alive Julianne Köpke was making her way through the jungle, alone, in desperate search of help. But wait, how is she alive? What happened? Where are the others? Why did the pilot continue flying into this storm? And what caused the plane to explode in the first place? Stay tuned here on the Obscurious channel, where together we unpack the facts and uncover the details surrounding the horrific yet miraculous true story of LANSA Air Flight 508. As always, if you like our content here, be sure to share, like, comment, and please, subscribe. Now let's get into it. Julianne was born on October 10, 1954, to German zoologist parents Maria and Hans Köpke in Lima, Peru. Her parents were there working together at the Museum of Natural History. Young Julianne spent a lot of time in the rainforest as her parents share their passion for biological life of all sorts. After a fairly normal childhood in the capital city, Julianne was 14 when her parents decided to relocate the family of 3 to a remote part of the Amazonian rainforest. There they would establish what became known as the Panguana research station. Her father spent most of his life studying the Peruvian and South American fauna, and now if you don't know what fauna is, don't worry, you're not alone. Fauna is all of the animal life present in a particular region or time, including plants and fungi and any living organism in between. Her mother was an ornithologist, a zoologist that specializes in bird species. There she was, 14 years old, living deep in the Peruvian jungle, in a home built on stilts that doubled as a biological research facility. Her days were spent studying and learning. Her mother, armed with binoculars and a 12-gauge shotgun, would lead Julianne on walks throughout the jungle, talking, learning, and bonding. Julianne's father also took Julianne out on regular embarkments throughout the jungle, studying and learning biology, wilderness survival, and life. Young Julianne soaked up her parents' lessons like a sponge, not knowing the value these lessons would later bring. The local school authority in Peru, however, did not approve of the homeschool situation and required Julianne to return to Peru to complete required classes and exams before she could graduate high school. So that's exactly what she did. Once these prerequisites were complete, she was ready to return home to the rainforest. Her mother had already arrived in Peru days earlier to pick up and make the trip home with her daughter. When she learned there was to be a graduation celebration and dance, Julianne really wanted to attend. Her mother, understanding the importance of attending these functions and creating lasting memories with her friends, decided they would be staying for a couple more days and would just return home on Christmas Eve morning, in time to spend the Christmas together as a family. This meant the world to young Julianne. She was so excited. The mother and daughter would spend quality time together the day before the big graduation and dance. They needed to find a dress for Julianne to wear, and the two enjoyed every minute together while searching stores before Julianne would find what she called the perfect dress, and her mother agreed, so they purchased the dress. The night of the graduation was magical and fun. I had a great time dancing with friends. It was truly memorable. This brings us to the day of the incident. As you know by now, it was December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1971, and this is Julianne's account of what she recalls from that fateful day. We woke up early that morning. Mother was worried about our ability to get a flight. This was long before internet booking by cell phone was an option. Once there, we learned the only airline we would be able to fly home that day was Lanza Airlines. Now my father did not want us to fly on Lanza. He had specifically told my mother, "Fly any airline you want, except do not fly Lanza." This airline had a poor reputation, and an even worse safety history, having just crashed a plane less than a year earlier, killing everyone on board. However, my mother was determined to get home for Christmas and was not afraid of flying Lanza. Once we got on the plane, everything was good, like chill, she recalls. Once in the air and the pilot announced we were at altitude, the seatbelt light went off, and while I stayed buckled in my seat, my mom and others were unbuckled and moving about the cabin. People were talking, getting drinks and snacks, and having a great time. The plane had not been cruising long when the captain noticed something. There were dark skies ahead. The pilot and his crew were aware they may encounter some inclement weather in their flight path, but this was not just inclement weather, it was a storm, a dark, ominous thunderstorm described as having thunder and lightning everywhere. For reasons one can only speculate, the pilot continued on the designated flight path, straight into the storm. It was not long before the air had become very turbulent. The plane began to shake violently as the storm jostled the aircraft around, up and down, left and right. Frightened, the passengers began to screaming with fear as drinks were spilling, magazines and serving trays were flying throughout the cabin, when suddenly, the overhead stowage compartments began to pop open from the force of the contents slamming into the doors. Christmas presents and carry-on luggage were now flying out of the bins, hitting passengers. I knew something was not right when my mother uttered the words, "I guess this is it." I just knew something bad was happening. Lightning was everywhere around the plane when a big bolt of lightning struck what looked like the right wing, but it actually hit the engine on that right side. We saw that happen. Then in an instant, the plane began to nosedive, rumbling and shaking when I heard a big boom. The whole side of the plane just peeled open. Julianne and the other passengers were watching in terror as people and belongings began to be sucked out of the aircraft. Everyone and everything not strapped in was sucked out right before my eyes. The sound was loud, so loud, it was deafeningly loud. People were screaming non-stop. Then suddenly I remember the screaming just stopped. Then it was the wind. All I could hear was the sound of wind. I knew I was no longer in the plane. I was still in my seat, but I was not in the plane. I was in open air, free falling from what I later learned authorities recorded as above 10,000 feet. I vividly remember tail whipping around and round when I caught a glimpse of the ground I was plummeting toward. I remember it looked like the top of broccoli. Julianne would awake several hours later, still securely strapped into her seat. She was alive. She struggled but was able to free herself from the seat, but it took several hours to get up on her feet. She remembers looking around and seeing horror. Bodies. Bodies were everywhere, she recalled. There were airplane parts all around us. The plane had been struck by lightning at an altitude of over 21,000 feet before rapidly descending until the plane disintegrated in midair at 10,000 feet over the Peruvian rainforest, the very jungle she has spent so much of her life in and called home. Now freed and on her feet, Julianne tried to locate her mother. She describes taking a stick and removing a shoe from any woman that she felt could have been her mother. She felt she could identify her mom by her feet and lack of toenail polish. She ultimately could not locate her mother and determined she needed to seek help. This is where the training and time spent with her parents in the jungle would prove to save her life. Her father had always taught her that in the event she finds herself lost in the rainforest to find water, follow that water until you find civilization, he would say, and that is what she did. Armed with a single bag of candy she had found at the crash site for food, she located a small stream, and despite the dangers, Julianne started walking in the water, and just as her father had explained, that stream led to a larger stream that led to a river, which ultimately led to a small fishing encampment. After surviving this horrific crash and navigating these treacherous waterways filled with all sorts of dangers for the past 9 days, she was relieved to see a small fisherman's cabin. Once there, she was disappointed to learn nobody was around and it appeared abandoned. Suffering injuries from the crash, including infected insect bites all over her head and body, extreme hunger and exhaustion, the battered but determined teenager was happy to take refuge in the fisherman's shack. Inside, she was able to give herself some much-needed first aid. Though rudimentary in nature, she found some medical supplies and gasoline which she decided to pour into a large cut on her arm in an effort to force out the maggots that filled the wound. Here in this shelter, she would fall asleep. Julianne then awoke to the sound of voices, male voices. Alas, she knew she was going to be rescued. Her first sight of these two men, she describes they looked like angels. I think they took one look at me and saw a zombie or something. They were really spooked, at first. Once I explained what had happened, though, they were eager to help. After sleeping another night, they took Julianne by canoe to the closest village, where she would be airlifted to the hospital. There, she was treated for the deep cut on her arm, numerous infections, and a broken collarbone. Julianne would be reunited with her father at the hospital. Days later, Julianne would head out leading search crews to the crash site. After making the trek to the crash site, the team would arrive at the site, and what they saw was sheer terror, something straight out of a bad horror film, one searcher said. There was plane wreckage spread throughout a large area, bodies and personal belongings everywhere. There were lifeless bodies still securely fastened to their seats, entire seat rows. Several seat rows had landed upside down or head first, leaving their bodies literally embedded into the ground to their waist. It was absolutely horrific. We could not find anything on how they determined it, but after the investigation was complete, it was ultimately determined that 14 people, including Julianne's mother, had actually survived the initial crash before succumbing to their injuries there on the ground. Julianne and her father would return home to Germany, where she would make a full recovery. Her father would later return to the jungle and the research facility he and his late wife had established, where he would continue his work. Meanwhile, Julianne completed university and followed in her parents' footsteps, becoming a zoologist. She would go on to have a distinguished career, and when her father passed away in 2000, Julianne would take over as the director of the Panguana research station that had played such an important role in her life and survival. As of the making of this video, Lanza Flight 508 is the most deadly lightning strike of an aircraft in aviation history. It is believed that the pilot chose to continue on the flight path because of mounting pressure from the airline to keep on schedule. In the weeks following this tragedy, Lanza Airlines would have their operating licenses revoked. Now, since you're still here, thank you. It means a lot. If it's not too much trouble, please give this video a like, maybe even subscribe to our channel. We are working hard to produce more great content, shedding light on obscure and curious factual true events. As always, thank you for watching Obscurious.